morning, everyone. Joe Dolan here. Greg Cosell there, fantasypoints.com. We are 1 week away, actually 6 days away from the NFL draft, and I'm pleased to be continuing our conversations with Greg Cosell about all his prospect evaluations, and I hope everybody has purchased and read the constantly updating fantasypoints.com prospect guide that Greg put so much time into. Greg, it's good to talk to you here, and since we were able to cover wide receivers like last week that essentially have a chance to go in the first round. Not all of them will, but all of them kind of had a chance to. There were some guys who you've watched and evaluated who you really like. We didn't even discuss last week. So I thought it was a smart idea to kind of break up this conversation into multiple days. And I know, Greg, with the growing nature of 11 personnel and obviously the proliferation of the passing game, a ton of wide receivers going to get drafted. I think 35 got drafted last year. It's been above 30 in like 6 of the last 7 years.
Yep.
So there's going to be a lot of guys drafted on days 2 and 3 of the NFL draft who are going to have a shot to come in and contribute at some point in their NFL careers.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Joe, we're at the point where pretty much every year receivers are the most drafted position. Maybe a year or two it's not, but there's always going to be receivers. All you have to do is think about the way the game is now played beginning at age 10 with all these 7-on-7 tournaments. And that's the way the game is kind of taught and played throughout the country. So there's always going to be receivers.
The top 2 drafted positions last year were corner and receiver. Well, what do they have in common, And
I think that's probably the way it will continue. Maybe there'll be 1 year that's an aberration, but I think for the most part, Joe, that's what you're going to see. Which raises a question, which we're not going to discuss now, but it's something I thought about and actually mentioned to Mike Tannenbaum this week. And he said, that's really interesting because obviously he's not working in the league now, but he's a GM at heart. I said, I wonder what's going to happen over the next number of years after we get through all these receivers now demanding a ton of money, and more power to them. I hope they get whatever they want. That's not the point. But I wonder if teams are ultimately going to say, hey, you know what? Yes, receivers are important and you need receivers, but there's always going to be more receivers coming through the pipeline.
Yeah.
So is it necessary to pay Tyreek Hill money to 5 or 10 NFL receivers when there's always going to be more receivers coming through the pipeline? Mike said to me, that's a great question. There's no answer, and I'm not making a judgment. I'm not saying that what's right or wrong here. I don't know the answer to that. I think that's just going to be a question that teams are going to start to think about, given the fact that, as you said, there could be 5 taken in the first. Who knows? But the point is, within the top 60 picks this year, there will be a lot of receivers taken.
There will be. We could have 10, 12 guys go in that top 60 picks. And we talked about the Jameson Williams, Chris Olave's, Drake Londons of the world on last week's program. If you want to hear Greg's opinions on those, how they transition to the league, the things they do well, the things they might need to improve on, just watch that on the Fantasy Points YouTube channel. We'll link it up. Ben will send an email out this weekend with everything blown up and just to make sure everybody's prepared for the draft. But Greg, I thought since you've watched so many receivers, we know 30 plus are going to get drafted. And here's the thing about wide receiver, just like corner, it doesn't matter if a team is deep or thin at the position. Everybody can draft a wide receiver every year.
Correct.
Because you need so many of them. So, there's a team like Atlanta that doesn't have any of them that people think are going to take 2 or 3, but there could be a team that's loaded at the position who's going to still take one because, as you mentioned, maybe there's a player who wants a big contract next year. So this is important for, I think, fans of fantasy, of course, but fans of any team to listen to. And I'm looking at some of like the big boards, and I'm just going to pick and choose some of these big boards with guys who I know you have watched and I know you have evaluated. And Greg, I'm going to start with a player you have evaluated. You have his evaluation up on the prospect guide. And this is Sky Moore out of Western Michigan. Now, Western Michigan is a team that has put some receivers in the league. The MAC is a conference that has put some receivers in the league. You watch Sky Moore, you watch Caleb Ellaby, his quarterback, and he's been a guy who has been getting some attention, I think, on Twitter. Fantasy Twitter has sort of been kind of liking Sky Moore quite a bit here. Had a hugely productive season at Western Michigan. You seem to like him, but you think he's a certain kind of receiver.
Yeah, I do. Now, he obviously in college, in that conference, the MAC, he played both outside and in the slot. My sense is he'll predominantly be a slot receiver in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
He lacks length. He's under 5'10". Now, we've seen the game change in the NFL, Joe, as you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not suggesting he's only going to line up in the slot. That's why I use the word predominantly. I think he's got a strong, compact frame because he's not slight. He was 195 pounds. I think the thing that stood out to me for a receiver that ran not many routes in college, he was featured on slant routes and glance routes. That was the foundation of what he ran. So he worked inside quite a bit. And I think what really stood out was he showed physical toughness, competitive toughness, because don't forget, he's not really a big man. My sense is that's the way you'll see him play in the NFL, that he'll be a slot receiver. He did make vertical catches at Western Michigan, and maybe he'll do some of that in the NFL, but I think you'll probably see him as a slot receiver who works inside.
Yeah, and when I think of, and I'm not comparing him to this player, but I just like whenever you mention like an undersized receiver who's physically tough, I always think of Steve Smith. Like I always think of his playing personality. Now I'm not comparing. Steve Smith's going to be a Hall of Famer. I'm not comparing Sky Moore to that. But is there like, when you think of body type and physical toughness, is that like just kind of a fair baseline archetype to?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Smith was off the charts in that regard. I would hate to say that about Sky Moore, who's never played in the NFL. Maybe he will be that guy, but Steve Smith was at the top end of that. The other thing with Sky Moore and why he does fit well in today's NFL is they also featured him on what have become called schemed manufactured touches, screens, orbit reverses, jet sweeps, RPO slants, a lot of motion. These are things that are now part of many NFL teams' offenses, and receivers like Sky Moore can be very, very effective running these kinds of plays, and I think you will see that. You will see him deployed that way in the NFL.
I think it was interesting, Greg, because you raised questions about his athletic profile in your evaluation. And the thing about Sky Moore, if you just look at the baseline measurables and what those things are supposed to tell you, he did run in a straight line well, but his agility drills, the 3-cone and the 20-yard shuttle, were probably below what you would like to see from a receiver his size.
Which is really interesting because, and I've talked to a number of people about him, and he's a little bit polarizing, Joe, because some see him as truly explosive. Others do not. I would fall into the category of saying that he's quick, but not sudden or purely explosive. That's the way I would see Sky Moore. He certainly wasn't slow, but I just didn't see him as one of those, I'll give you an example. I viewed last year Elijah Moore coming out of Ole Miss as a better prospect.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, obviously he had a nice rookie season. Sorry, Crimpet is they're big fans, Greg. So Butterscotch and Crimpet are here to listen. They're causing some havoc in the background.
I see. Yeah.
There she is. Greg, I also want to talk, since we've done a good job, I think, kind of relating like a big picture aspect to these conversations. When you're evaluating a receiver, we talked about Christian Watson last week out of North Dakota State, which is a different level than the MAC. But do you have, I don't want to say problems, but do you always have to filter watching a MAC level wide receiver through a different lens than if you're watching somebody like, say, a Chris Olave or a Jamison Williams?
I think you're aware of that, but then it comes down to how you view the traits. In other words, Christian Watson simply ran by everybody at his level of football. You and I know that no one runs by everybody in the NFL. So you immediately say, yes, he's fast. We know he's fast. That's not a profound scoop to say that Christian Watson is fast. But we also know, as we take it a step further, Joe, because what are we doing here? what I'm doing. Obviously, we're doing fantasy now, but what I'm doing is I'm projecting and transitioning players to the next level. Christian Watson is not simply going to line up on the outside and run by everybody in the NFL.
Right.
No one does that. So, yes, depending on the style of receiver and what he's doing in college, that does factor in. We know Jamison Williams because he does play in the SEC and ran by Georgia just like he ran by every other SEC school. We know that he has high level explosive speed. We know that. Christian Watson does too, but it's not going to be that easy at the next level.
For sure. Greg, let's get now to another receiver from, well, not from a small school by any stretch of the imagination, but it's somebody who I've started to see get a little bit of hype now. And you actually sent me his evaluation very early in the process. And he is somebody I know you are a big fan of. You think he could come in and contribute right away. And that's Khalid Shakir out of Boise State. And this is a guy who I thought was kind of flying under the radar, and it seems people are starting to catch on. This is somebody you evaluated very early in the process, though.
I did. And you know me, Joe. I don't, this is my evaluation based on tape study. I don't change my opinion based on reading others' mock drafts or anything like that. I watched his tape, and his tape's not going to change. Now, he lined up in multiple locations with different splits in Boise State's offense. So he does have position versatility. But 70% of his receptions in 2021 came out of the slot. And my sense is most evaluators and coaches will see him, again, predominantly is the operative word, as a slot receiver. Now, can you line him up elsewhere? Probably. I mean, he's 6 feet tall, so he's not short. And I really enjoyed watching him. I think he has a strong profile. He's versatile. He's refined and detailed in his route running. He's got separation quickness, tremendous body control and hands, run after catch, very, very competitive. There was very little about his game I did not like. And I think, to me, it seemed that he could step right in and be a contributor in 11 personnel packages. Again, target share, those kinds of things, that's always tough to say because that becomes specific to a team, and we'll find out next weekend, obviously. But hey, if he goes to a team that's heavy 11 personnel, like I'm not saying he's going to the Rams, but obviously the Rams led the league in 11 personnel. If you go to a team that plays a high percentage of 11 personnel that maybe needs a receiver, I could see Shakir being a guy that is a meaningful part of the pass offense as a rookie.
Wandel Robinson out of Kentucky. This guy was interesting. He is small. That's obviously going to be maybe kind of a theme here with some of these receivers who are going to go on days 2 and 3. But it looked like he was a pretty fascinating evaluation for you, despite his size and how he was used at Kentucky.
Yeah, another guy that's essentially a slot receiver, caught 104 balls. 84 of those 104 came out of the slot. I think that'll be the case in the NFL. Another guy with manufactured scheme touches, which, as we said when we spoke about Sky Moore, have become significant parts of many offenses in the NFL. And I think that Robinson will be much more than just, a stationary slot receiver. I don't think he has home run speed, but he's sudden, he's agile, he's dynamic. He can create explosive plays in different ways, whether he's working out of the slot. If you give him free access, he does have enough speed that he can get vertical. He can gain vertical separation on slot fades. We saw that in college. Another guy that did play in the SEC, so he played at the highest level of college football. He can run option routes, inside routes we think of backs running, Joe. He's really good on tunnel and bubble screens where there's a run after catch element. That's what he's really good at. He's a playmaking type receiver. So again, I don't want to say it always, I always find it interesting when people say, well, I have to figure out how to use them. I think people know these things.
Yeah.
I think they know what Wandel Robinson is. And I think that that's the way he'll be used. We see more teams understanding that not everybody just lines up in one place. The game has changed in many ways.
So this is going to be a transition point for me to talk about like something you always mention, and I know why people want them. I know why people expect them. Big boards, lists, ranking prospects. Okay, Wandel Robinson at 5'8", 178.
Yep.
Is you posit that, and I completely understand this. Two teams are going to rank him vis-a-vis Romeo Dubs completely differently.
Correct.
They're completely different players. So one team might have Robinson as a second-round pick. Another team might have him as a fifth-round pick. Correct. And that's why it's hard to rank these guys.
Which is why I always struggle, as you know, Joe, and I'm not sarcastic about it, why I struggle with lists. Because what happens in the NFL is every coach has a general philosophy, okay? They start with that because you have to teach something. Now, obviously, every coach will tell you that adjustments are made based on the players that they have. Particularly if a new staff comes in, they can't just have 11 new players on offense the next year. So they have to deal with what they have. And sometimes you make adjustments based on that. But clearly, every offensive coach has a philosophy and approach, and they would like certain kinds of players based on their approach. Some teams might say, hey, I look at Wandel Robinson, and I think this guy, he fits exactly what I want to do. Others might say, you know what? I really don't want a 5'8", 178-pound receiver. I'm really looking for receivers who are 6 feet, 6'2". That's what I really want to make my offense work the way I truly want to run it. So it's very hard to make lists of receivers.
If you're looking for a boundary X, and we had the conversation about the importance of the big traditional boundary X last week. Some teams view it very, very importantly. Others teams think they can put somebody who might not fit that profile at X. They feel like they can survive with that. But there is a player who I think is going to go on day 2, and I always mess up his name because I know it is Dubs. It's Romeo Dubs of Nevada.
Romeo Dubs, yeah.
Yeah, it's Dubs. This is a player who he might fit the traditional boundary X, or at least is able to line up there. And he was a fascinating evaluation for you too, Greg, because people also love comparisons. You made an interesting comparison, and you're never going to say that he's going to become the level of player that you compared him to. But traits-wise, you recalled Devonta Adams when he was at Fresno State.
Yeah, and again, you just said that. So, of course, everything I now say, no one's going to hear, Joe. We might as well move on to the next guy, because no one is going to hear one word that I say now. But I'll say it anyway. So he's 6'2", 200 pounds. I liked his tape. Now, what happened with him, with Romeo Dubes, is apparently he did not have a good Senior Bowl week, and he fell off the radar. Mm-hmm. But I think his tape is pretty good. He's big. He's kind of sleek because he's 6'2", but he's not 220. He's 200. I think there's a little bit of an explosive feel to his movement. I think he can become a 3-level receiver in the NFL, not a burner. You know, and again, when I talked about Devonta Adams and thought of that comparison, I thought of Devonta Adams at Fresno State. I didn't think of Devonta Adams in the last 3 years in the NFL. And don't forget, if people want to look at Devonta Adams' first 2, 3 years in the NFL, certainly 2, he was only catching what, Joe, 45, 50 balls those early years?
And Greg, not only that, and I'll have people remember, and this is just a great example of how it takes time. Devonta Adams caught 38 balls in his first year and 50 his second. Over that span, he was one of the least, if not the least efficient receiver on a per-target basis in the entire NFL. So it took some time for Devonta Adams to become Devonta Adams.
And I remember that there were people who thought he wouldn't make it. Mm-hmm. You know, he was a second-round pick, I believe, was he not?
Out of Fresno State, and that was in that loaded 2014 NFL draft class that had Mike Evans and Sammy Watkins and Odell Beckham and Brandon Cooks, and he was a second-round pick.
Yeah, and he wasn't viewed as a player of that caliber, by the way. And obviously, I think Adams is the best receiver in the NFL right now. But the point is when he came out of Fresno State, he was a second-round pick, and it took him a good number of years to really become Devonta Adams, and taking nothing away from Adams. But he's also been on a team that has not had big-time receivers playing with him, so the target share has been really high, deservedly so because of his ability. But they don't have, it's not as if he's on a team that has another really, really good receiver that might cut down his target share. So that's from a fantasy perspective, obviously. But I think Romeo Dubs, I thought there was a little bit of an explosive dimension to his game. He lined up inside. He lined up outside. He did play boundary X, as you said. I thought he could work between the numbers, outside the numbers. I kind of liked his tape quite a bit. I thought that he's a guy that could come into the league, and even if he doesn't do it right away, just like Devonta Adams didn't, I think that he could become a really good receiver down the road.
I think that's a fascinating comparison in another way, because Dubs is also coming into the league. Now, keep in mind, Devonta Adams and Derek Carr were both second-round picks in 2014. Correct. I think there's a chance both Dubs and Carson Strong are day 2 picks.
Yeah, probably that could well be the case.
Yeah.
I would think. Yeah, Strong. Well, in my view, won't be a first-round pick, but who knows? But you're right. But I liked Romeo Dubs, and like I said, I know I spoke to people who were at the Senior Bowl, and he kind of fell off the face of the earth because he did not have a great week.
Mm-hmm. Greg, a guy who now, I know I'm jumping around, but I'm just picking out interesting names, looking at like big boards and people who players who I think fans and listeners want to hear asked about. And now I'm going to go to another big time conference player who was big time productive in college. But the athletic testing, and I don't think this is a surprise based on his tape, the athletic testing might be, to borrow a term from you, below the line. And that is David Bell of Purdue, who was massively productive in the Big Ten.
Yeah, and David Bell is your classic case of a guy, because of the athletic testing, that I bet a lot of people will say no until you watch his tape. He ran a 4.65, and his 10-yard split was poor. His vertical jump didn't suggest any kind of explosion. And in fact, seeing all that, it made, and this is not a comparison, but it made me think of being in the dome at the combine when Anquan Bolden ran a 4.72, and there were audible sighs, Joe, because when a receiver runs a 4.72, I bet a lot of people took him off their board, much less draft him high. Bell to me is a professional receiver. He lined up outside. I think his game's about detail, nuance. It's certainly not about high level athleticism or explosiveness. You can watch his tape, and I made this note in my transition part, that the process of route running and the detail and the nuance is important to him. He understands those things. He's made himself into a technician and a natural receiver, even though there's not an explosive element to his game. He's certainly not a great athlete. He's very measured, methodical. He's one speed. But I think that there's a place for him in the NFL, depending on team and scheme. I made the comparison to Van Jefferson coming out of Florida, who I think might have been he was a second or a third.
He was a second-round pick.
Now, Jefferson has a little more vertical juice than Bell, but I don't know if we'd call Jefferson a vertical burner. But Jefferson, when you watched his tape coming out of college, was, again, very detailed. Of course, his dad is Sean Jefferson, who played in the league for years and is a wide receiver coach in the league. But Jefferson was very detailed in his route running. Bell is the same way. He's big. He catches the ball. There's always a place for those receivers.
One guy, and I know he outweighs this player, but I remember another hyper-productive Power 5 conference receiver who was maybe a little below the line on testing, and that was Tyler Boyd when he came out of Pitt.
Yep.
And you said Bell can be a slot receiver with his detail. Could you see like a Tyler Boyd kind of transition for him?
Sure.
Who obviously has become a very good receiver in the league.
And he's not explosive.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I could easily see that. Bell's going to play in the league. It's just a matter of where and how he's utilized. But he's a professional receiver. He made he's not a quote unquote number one. He's not going to be targeted 140 times, but he's going to play. And those kinds of receivers tend to be very important on third down because, when it's 3rd and 7, a lot of the pretty gliders, those guys are not the big factors on third down. I mean, I'll give you an example. I don't know where Chris Olave is going to go, and I don't know what he's going to do in the NFL, but he is a certain kind of receiver. He's a smooth, fluid glider. He was only targeted 17 times all season on third down. Think about that for a minute. Now, it's college football, and Ohio State, won a lot of games by relatively big scores, but he was not a third down receiver for Ohio State. So then you have to think, is he going to be that guy in the NFL if he was not in college? Is he going to make tough contested catches when it's 3rd and 8? David Bell will. So he might be the kind of guy that averages, 10.2 yards a catch, and his target share would be very much a function of team.
But he moves the chains on third downs, which is obviously hugely important. Greg, another Power 5 receiver, obviously like the Power 5 in the SEC, coming off an injury. We talked about his teammate Jameson Williams last week. John Mechie out of Alabama. We're going to expect to hear his name called on day 2 of the draft. He's not as highly regarded as his teammates, but this is somebody who has the skills to come in and contribute in the NFL. And quite frankly, if the injury checks out, could do it pretty soon.
Yeah, I like John Mechie's tape. I watched him last summer, and I watched him this year, obviously, as well. I think he can play inside or outside. He very much reminded me of Robert Woods. That was the way I saw Mechie. They obviously teach receivers at Alabama how to run routes. Mechie's a very good route runner. You wouldn't call him purely explosive, but he can get vertical. I think has a little more juice than people are giving him credit for. As I said, he's not a burner. He's got really good route and separation quickness, good play speed. I think he can win from the outside. He can win from the slot. I think he knows how to set up and attack press coverage. Obviously, at Alabama, they run NFL route trees, so he can do that. I'd like John Mechie a lot. You're right. He's not going to be a first-round pick because he doesn't have that explosive dimension to his game, and because he's 5'11", 187. But I'm sure he'll be fine. Most guys come back from ACLs, and from what I understand, it was a relatively minor ace. He didn't tear,
he didn't blow out other ligaments.
It was clean. So he'll be back. Maybe not week 1 this year, but he'll be back. I like John Mechie.
Yeah, and I think it's still fascinating because you've mentioned some comparisons here today, and you're talking about Robert Woods. You mentioned Van Jefferson. We already talked about Devonta Adams. And the thing that stands out to me about all of these guys, Greg, is that these comparisons you're making, none of those guys we mentioned, Tyler Boyd, none of them were first-round picks.
Correct.
None of them. And if you look at the most productive receivers in the NFL this year, Cooper Kupp, he was a 3rd-round pick. Devonta Adams was a 2nd-round pick. Deebo Samuel was a 2nd-round pick. Stephon Diggs was a 5th-round pick. These days are hugely important, and it's always important to remember that all these guys were considered flawed in some way, and they weren't first-round picks. So, we could be talking about John Mechie in a few years as a very productive NFL receiver.
That's why I just posed the question when we started, Joe, about paying receivers. And like I said, I hope they all get paid. But our team's going to say, wait a second, we don't need to do that because there's always going to be receivers. You didn't mention A.J. Brown, a 2nd-round pick.
Yeah, he was a 2nd-round pick. I'm going through the fantasy leaderboards, Greg, of guys who have caught a ton of passes. Hunter Renfrow was a 5th or 6th-round pick. So, I mean,
there's always going to be receivers, and there certainly are in this draft.
Yeah. Let's get to Jalen Tolbert, South Alabama, another small school guy. 6'1" and 1/8, 194, ran sub 4.5. He's a long receiver. Interesting player though.
Yeah, smooth, fluid. I think he's probably an outside receiver just because of the way he's built. I think he's got that size, length, 3-level profile. When he has free access off the line of scrimmage, you see the stride length and the build-up speed, and that translates to some explosiveness. I think he's got more long acceleration than short area separation quickness, but he's got really good body control. He can make contested catches on vertical routes and in the red zone. I wouldn't call him physical. I think there'll be questions about his ability to defeat press and work the middle of the field effectively. I'm not saying he can't do it. I think in draft rooms, they'll ask these questions. Yeah. See, I think what people have to understand, Joe, is when I sit here and watch the tape, you see strengths, then you see things where you just raise questions. It doesn't mean they can't, and you're not saying that you never see it on tape and there's no way a guy can do it. It's just a question because you know it's being discussed. I've had conversations with GMs and coaches. This is what these are the things they discuss. And so, I think Tolbert definitely has the look and movement of an NFL wide receiver. And ultimately, he's smooth, he's fluid, he's a strider, he's got good length, he's athletic. I think he works best on the outside in the NFL.
So we talked about some guys like David Bell who were hyper productive but didn't have the ideal measurables.
Right.
This on the other side of the equation, you're going to see guys who weren't hyper productive but did have just outrageously good measurables at the combine get drafted on day 2. And that leads me to Alec Pierce from Cincinnati, who was the top target for Desmond Ritter there. Not to say he didn't have a bad year. He had 884 yards and 8 touchdowns, but certainly not putting up numbers in the David Bell kind of tier. But his measurables, he jumped out of the building. He ran a 4.41. He's 6'3", 211. And you think he has the ability to line up at boundary X at the next level?
I do. Mm-hmm. And I really liked his tape a lot. He's very athletic. He's tall. He plays big. He plays long. He plays fast. He's got stride length. He's got body control. He's got hands. There was a strong feel to his movement. He defeated press coverage. He has accelerating speed. He got on top of corners in college football. You wouldn't say he's sudden and explosive, but he's a really good natural athlete. And again, a lot of people like to talk about contested catches. He's got great hand-eye coordination. He's got a wide catching radius. He's got high-level competitiveness at the catch point. I really like Alec Pierce a lot. Yeah. I'm so curious to see where he gets drafted because, as you said, he played for a team that wasn't one of those teams that threw it, 50 times a game.
Right.
They didn't play that way. So therefore, just his targets were lower than a lot of other guys. I wonder if he was on USC and they threw him the ball the way they threw it to Drake London, if he could have done what Drake London did. But they didn't do that at Cincinnati.
Well, they had obviously Ford, who was a good running back. And they were balanced, which is also so fascinating to me because then you talk about Desmond Ritter, who I actually, Greg, I know we talked about Ritter a couple of weeks ago, but I expect his name to be called on day 1 of the NFL draft.
And don't forget, Cincinnati had a really good defense too.
Yes.
So they had a lot of games where they didn't need to just toss it around the yard.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying though is the measurables, they showed up on the film.
Without question.
Yeah.
Without question.
And I'm going to get to another guy who cooked in the 40, also 6'2", 181, Tyquan Thornton out of Baylor, 4.28 speed. There is a vertical, you always say guys don't play to their time speed or they play faster than their time speed. Tyquan Thornton's kind of one of those guys who on film, it kind of matched up for him.
Oh, without question. He was a track guy too.
Yeah.
In high school, he ran 100 meters and he ran 200 meters. So he's a track guy, but he's a football player. So he's from South Florida, and almost all South Florida receivers have grit to them. That's just South Florida high school football. They play some of the best high school football in America there. He's got a length and speed profile in a rail thin frame, but this kid can run. He may be as vertically explosive as any receiver in this class, including Jamison Williams. It's just that no one's talking about him that way, obviously, because it's Baylor. They were very good, but it's not Alabama. But you're right. His track speed did show up on tape. He lined up almost exclusively on the outside. He beat press coverage. I mean, this guy had some refinement to him, and he was tough. He played with some grit, and normally these kinds of guys don't. They just look pretty on the outside. I was very, very intrigued by him, and I'm very curious to see as his career progresses, number one, where he gets drafted, number two, how he's used. And he's one of those guys, as his career progresses, I'm going to be fascinated because I think he has a chance. Again, maybe he's not going to catch 90 balls, Joe, but I think this guy's going to play in the NFL and be a factor.
Mekhi Polk, Mississippi State. He's getting a little bit of buzz. Another one of those guys who might not have like the athletic testing you're looking for, and he played for Mike Leach. So everybody, you might just say, oh, you know, the numbers are empty. But there was something to his tape that suggests he could be a pretty darn good NFL receiver. This was a guy who didn't, just because he was in the air raid offense, this wasn't somebody who lacked nuance and detail.
No, I liked him.
Yeah.
I liked him a lot, and I didn't know much about him. Obviously, air raid. He was a transfer from, I believe, California. So he obviously went to Mississippi State. He knew he was going to get thrown a lot of balls there, and he was.
Good decision.
I thought he had really good route quickness. I thought he had a feel for attacking the leverage of corners. Now he's going to get the air raid label placed on him. He's going to get the lack of speed. And by the way, his 40 time was right there with Mike Thomas from the Saints and DeAndre Hopkins from the Cards. And I'm not sitting here saying he's that guy, but I think you have to be careful about dismissing 40 times with receivers that have some good size to them. His kid's over 6'3". I liked his tape. I mean, he has an innate feel for route running. He has really good body control and hands. When I was finished watching him, I said, wow, this guy was kind of fun to watch. And I like him. I think I'm not going to sit here and compare him to Michael Thomas from the Saints. But there was something about his game that at times made me think of Thomas.
Very interesting. You mentioned something there that I always love when it always turns out that it seems like the guys you really like to talk about are the ones you didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
And maybe somebody asked you about him. And I know you brought this up when you told me about this player when you were sending his evaluation. You were basically asked about him and if you had seen him and you had never heard of him. Kyle Phillips out of UCLA ended up being a player. I think he's going to be a day 3 pick, but he ended up being a player you actually liked a lot on film when you watched him.
Yeah, he's a slot receiver in the NFL.
Yeah.
But I think I said this about Cooper Kupp when he came out of Eastern Washington, and Kupp's a bigger man. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, Joe. So I don't want people to think I'm saying, oh, this guy's Cooper Kupp, and then in 4 years he's going to catch, 900 balls. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But as you probably recall, when Kupp came out of Eastern Washington, and by the way, Kupp ran a 4.62 40 at the combine, and a lot of people said, oh, that's going to kill him. I said about Cooper Kupp then, I said he could roll out of bed and play in the slot tomorrow. You might recall that.
Yeah, I do.
I think Kyle Phillips is that guy. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm not saying he's Cooper Kupp because there's significant differences, but I think Phillips could roll out of bed tomorrow and play in the slot in the NFL.
Yeah.
I think that he has a great feel for attacking the positioning and the leverage of off-coverage corners and safeties because he plays in the slot, using a combination of body fakes, head feints. He creates space for his cuts. I really liked watching this kid. And again, you're 100% right. I knew zero about him.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, we're going to have to do the everybody's favorite thing to do, white guy to white guy comparison. But athletic measurables, very, very similar to Hunter Renfrow coming out of Clemson. And Hunter Renfrow caught a ton of passes this year. And he was a 5th-round pick. So, Kyle Phillips ran exactly the same. They weigh exactly the same. Phillips is actually an inch taller than Renfrow, but obviously Renfrow has become an excellent NFL player.
Yeah, and it would not surprise me if Phillips is the same. Phillips will be very much a function of where he goes. Obviously, he needs to be given that opportunity, but I think he's one of those guys. I really liked him. And actually, he would have had way better numbers, but they didn't have very good quarterback play.
Yeah. Greg, I'm going to get one bonus question in here because I don't think there was enough material for us to do an entire stream on tight ends. But before we go, I want to get one bonus question in on here, especially for our dynasty players who are looking for a tight end in this class. I know Jelani Woods was somebody who jumped off the tape to you with his athletic ability.
Well, first of all, his size.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy
he's huge.
Is huge. And he looks huge. He's 6'7", 253. And his arm length and wingspan are ridiculous. And I think what's amazing about Woods is he was a quarterback in high school in Georgia and led his team to a state championship. So he went to Oklahoma State where they switched him to tight end and never threw him the ball. Yeah. So he obviously transferred for his final year to Virginia where they threw the ball a ton and therefore put up some numbers. I think he's just scratching the surface, Joe. I mean, you're talking about rare size, good movement, good hands, body control, some run after catch. He's competitive. I think there's a lot there to work with, which makes him super intriguing. And he may not be ready to play, week 1 this year. But I think that given the way the NFL game is going with tight ends, I think you will see him being a factor certainly by year 2 in the NFL.
Greg, one of the all-time great calls that you helped us with was a guy who actually played less football in college than this. But when you watched Jimmy Graham caught, I think, like 13 passes at Miami.
Right.
But the athletic ability, and this is what the transition is, the athletic ability just jumped off the page to you, even on those few catches. I'm not saying Jelani Woods is going to become Jimmy Graham, but he was somebody who also was scratching the surface. And
I appreciate you giving me credit, but I don't want to take the credit in that sense, because where did he do this? He did it for the Saints. Okay. Yeah. That's where he started, with a coach who understood all that. Yeah. See, that's the key factor for so many of these guys. It's where they go. So yes, did I notice that this guy could be something in the NFL because of everything you just mentioned? Yeah, I did. I'm sure I wasn't the only one, so I don't want to sit here and say, wow, I was the only one who knew that. But if he had gone to a team, let's say, that didn't feature the tight end, who knows? Maybe you never hear of Jimmy Graham. But he went to the Saints with Sean Payton, who understood all that.
But my point with Woods is, would you be stunned based on his, despite the relative lack of production, would you be stunned if he was a second-round pick because of that athletic ability?
Stunned, no, because I've seen too much.
Yeah.
He'd be a second-round pick for a team that you and I would say immediately, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
He wouldn't be a second-round pick for a team that's not going to feature the tight end.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thank you for so much for this. We've got the NFL draft coming up next week. These like little discussions have been just utterly revealing to me. We did quarterbacks, running backs, and 2 days worth of wide receivers. They're all on the Fantasy Points YouTube page. Make sure you subscribe to the Prospect Guide if you haven't already. Kukanis is going to be sending out, blasting an email to everybody to get on it. We've had a lot of fun talking about this. Greg, and now the next thing to do is reconvene after the draft and talk about the landing spots, because as you mentioned, those are so important.
That's important. Super important, obviously, for fantasy. Yes.
Yeah. But I mean, I know how your brain works, and you're going to, when a team drafts Jelani Woods, you're going to get excited when you're like, oh, see, now that is interesting. And that becomes just a just completely different discussion.
Well, of course.
Which I think is going to be fascinating.
Yeah. The perfect example of that last year was Brandon Ayuk. Mm-hmm. I thought that was the perfect spot for him. And, and I think you'll see that continue, especially if they don't have Debo.
Yeah. Greg, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for watching. If you're watching on demand, I hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk to you guys in a couple of weeks after we reconvene after the draft. Thanks everybody. Enjoy the NFL draft next week.